It was June 23, 2012. The Ridgeport Hounds were playing their longtime rivals, the Hazleton Hawks, in a minor league showdown that had filled nearly every seat in the bleachers. It was a Saturday. The weather was warm. Concession lines were long, and the sound of laughter, announcer chatter, and occasional boos folded into a familiar summer rhythm. Among the crowd, in Section 34, Row H, Seat 18, sat 15-year-old Daniel Rudd. He was with his father, Greg, a factory foreman who'd saved up to surprise his son with the tickets. It was the last game of the season. The Ridgeport Hounds were leading 6-3 by the top of the 7th, and by the bottom of the 8th, Daniel Rudd was gone. Greg would later tell investigators that Daniel had asked to use the restroom. They hadn't left their seats all game. Greg pointed toward the aisle, handed him the stub just in case, and watched him walk up the steps. A few minutes passed, then a few more, then 15. Greg thought maybe the line was long, then 20, then 30. He got up, walked toward the concession area, checked the restrooms, waited outside, looked for the bright red cap Daniel had been wearing. Nothing. He walked faster, then ran. By the time the game ended and people began filtering out through the metal turnstiles, Greg Rudd was shouting his son's name through a sea of casual indifference. Security was called. Announcements were made. Ridgeport PD arrived just after 9 p.m. Daniel's photo was shown to stadium staff. Volunteers helped sweep each seating section. The bathrooms were searched again. All exits were checked. But no one had seen Daniel. No one remembered seeing a boy walking out alone. No fans, no ushers, no food vendors. He hadn't gone to first aid. His name wasn't called in for any lost item claim. It was as if he had evaporated from his seat without moving through any of the paths a person would need to take to leave. By 11 p.m., helicopters had joined the search. The wooded area behind the south end of the stadium was combed by flashlight. Greg Rudd stayed behind with an officer, pointing out which direction his son had gone, which restroom he would have used, where the last place was he could have been seen. The stadium lights stayed on all night. For the first 48 hours, it was handled like a missing child case. Amber alerts were issued. Flyers went up across Ridgeport and surrounding towns. Local news stations ran live segments from the stadium. Hundreds of volunteers showed up the next morning. Some brought dogs, some brought drones. A large portion of Ridgeport was shut down as authorities blocked roadways and checked security footage from nearby businesses. Daniel's image, a high school photo taken just months earlier, was posted across billboards and rest stop monitors. But nothing new emerged. Detectives canvassed everyone who had sat in Section 34 that night. Most remembered the game. A few vaguely remembered the boy with the red cap. One woman recalled seeing him eating popcorn. Another thought he had a notebook or program in his lap. No one reported seeing anything strange. No one remembered a struggle, no yelling, no running. No one saw him walk toward an exit. Greg Rudd was questioned extensively. Police needed to rule out all possibilities. He passed every interview, every polygraph. There were no signs of domestic issues. His relationship with Daniel was described by friends and neighbors as close, quiet, and typical. They had attended several games that season, always together. Greg had bought the tickets weeks in advance. The only unusual thing, he said later, was that Daniel had seemed distracted during the game, less interested in the score, more interested in scanning the crowd. By the end of that weekend, the case began shifting. What had started as a search for a lost teen began to carry darker weight. Surveillance footage from the stadium's outer concourse was pulled. Cameras were functional only in certain zones. One camera that might have caught Daniel leaving the men's room was found to be offline. Another at the northeast exit was partially obstructed by a tarp that had been put up during a recent thunderstorm and never taken down. Detectives realized they were operating with less visibility than they thought. For days, they chased tips. A gas station attendant claimed he saw a boy matching Daniel's description buying candy that night. The timestamp didn't match. A jogger said they saw something red in the woods. It turned out to be a lost T-ball cap. None of it added up. Each clue brought more frustration. Each theory unraveled on closer inspection. By the end of the first week, the crowds had thinned. The flyers stayed up, but the air of urgency faded. Ridgeport police kept a dedicated team on the case, but leads dried up. No ransom note, no confirmed sightings, no messages from Daniel's phone, no evidence of online grooming. It was as if Ridgeport's most public place had swallowed a boy whole, while thousands watched a baseball game unfold around him. Investigators would later say that in most missing persons cases, the first 24 hours are critical. In Daniel's case, the first 24 produced nothing. No fingerprints, no digital activity, no clothing, no screams. Just a seat left empty after the 7th inning, and a father who refused to stop searching even as the world moved on. 13 years later, that same stadium seat would jam shut during routine maintenance, and what they'd find inside it would change everything they thought they knew about that night. By the 3rd day, search efforts around the Ridgeport Stadium began to fracture. The urgency remained, but the structure beneath it, the procedures, the plans, the assumptions, started to crack. On paper, it should have been straightforward. A 15-year-old boy walked out of his seat during a baseball game and never came back. The area was closed, defined, and full of witnesses. But the more law enforcement tried to map out Daniel Rudd's final moments, the more they realized the edges of the picture had already faded. The upper deck, where Daniel and his father had been sitting, had no working surveillance. A technician later admitted the camera had shorted out weeks earlier during a thunderstorm. No one had gotten around to replacing it. Budget issue. There were cameras in the lower concourse and the West Gate turnstiles, but Daniel was never seen on any of them. The initial witness statements came in quickly, over 30 in the first 48 hours. At first, police were encouraged. A teenage girl thought she saw Daniel standing near the nacho counter. A man in a vendor jersey said he remembered a kid in a red cap asking about the time. But the descriptions started to diverge. One person said the boy was alone. Another said he was walking with an older man. Someone else claimed they saw him heading toward the south stairwell, but a vendor in that area said it was closed off that night for maintenance. A few details lined up, but the rest fell apart under scrutiny. In the heat of the game, memories blurred. People filled in blanks without realizing. By the end of the week, police had more theories than facts and fewer answers than they had on day one. Volunteers expanded the search zone. A 3-mile radius around the stadium was combed by foot. The wooded areas near the southern edge were searched inch by inch. Canoes were used to drag shallow parts of the nearby Quail River. Divers went in twice. Cadaver dogs were brought in by a private team. One of them alerted near a rusted equipment shed on the stadium's north side. Investigators rushed in, but the shed was empty. The alert was ruled inconclusive, possibly triggered by wildlife remains or trace evidence too degraded to interpret. Still, it was the closest anyone had gotten to something physical. Rumors began almost immediately. Ridgeport was a town of only 40,000 people, and within days everyone had an opinion. Some said Daniel had run away. Others claimed he was abducted by a stadium employee. One theory claimed a traveling food vendor had snuck him out in a storage crate. Another insisted that the boy was never inside the stadium to begin with, that the entire disappearance had been staged. Conspiracy forums online latched on. A YouTube video with 500,000 views argued that a human trafficking ring was operating inside the stadium infrastructure. None of it was based on verified evidence, but the noise made real work harder. Anonymous calls poured in. People swore they saw Daniel in grocery stores, on buses, even in another state. Every lead ended the same way, in a dead end. The most painful reality settled in slowly. The stadium itself was working against them. The structure had been built in the 1970s, with multiple undocumented renovations over the decades. Sub-level corridors had been repurposed and abandoned. Access tunnels once used for equipment were now blocked or forgotten. A stadium contractor admitted that some blueprints were missing entirely. Police asked for permission to bring in ground-penetrating radar beneath the bleachers. Stadium management declined. They claimed it could damage the infrastructure and delay scheduled games. A deeper excavation would require city permits, engineering approvals, insurance waivers. Greg Rudd begged them. He even offered to pay for the scans himself. They said no. By day 10, the tone of the investigation had shifted. The initial optimism that Daniel might have gotten lost or injured was replaced by a heavier suspicion, one no one wanted to say out loud, that someone had taken him, and that whoever did it knew the layout of the stadium better than the people searching it. It was the only explanation that made sense. To disappear in a public place without anyone noticing meant planning, familiarity, timing, confidence. It was no longer about a moment of confusion. It was a controlled vanishing. Greg Rudd refused to go home. He started sleeping in his pickup, parked outside the east entrance. Every day he walked the aisles, retraced steps, asked new staff members the same old questions. He kept a notebook with scribbled maps and names of people he'd spoken to. Police warned him not to interfere. He didn't care. He told a local reporter that he'd never leave that parking lot until someone gave him a reason to believe his son wasn't inside that stadium. Behind the scenes, the Ridgeport PD hit a wall. With no suspects, no physical evidence, and no confirmed timeline, they quietly began reducing manpower. The case shifted to a cold file status before the end of the summer. The lead detective called it the most infuriating investigation of my career. They had a name, they had a time, they had a location. And still, it wasn't enough. Years later, people would remember that summer as the one where everything stopped. The games continued, but no one sat in seat 18 of row H again. Some said it was bad luck. Others said it was because no one could sit there without thinking about what happened, or what might have. No one knew for sure what had become of Daniel Rudd. But somewhere in that maze of concrete and corridors, the silence kept pressing back like it had something left to say. Greg Rudd stopped going home. After the 7th day with no trace of his son, he packed a duffel bag with clothes, a half-used notebook, and a folder full of missing person flyers, and moved into his truck. He parked it on the edge of Lot B, right next to the east entrance of Ridgeport Stadium. He left the engine off most nights, cracked the windows, and sat in the driver's seat watching the upper rows fade into the dark. It became his new routine. He'd wake up just after sunrise, brush his teeth with bottled water behind the scoreboard dumpsters, and spend his days walking the concourse, talking to stadium workers, memorizing every face that passed through the gates. Even when games weren't scheduled, he stayed. He believed Daniel was still inside. At first, people saw it as devotion. The media picked up on his presence. Local stations ran interviews. Headlines called him the father who refused to leave. He made appeals on radio. He spoke directly into cameras with the same calm certainty. Daniel didn't run away. He didn't get lost. He didn't leave. Something happened inside the stadium, and someone knew what it was. When Ridgeport PD began stepping back their daily involvement, Greg only pushed harder. He filed complaints against the stadium's management, claiming they were hiding something. When that didn't work, he filed a civil suit demanding full access to maintenance areas beneath the bleachers. The court denied the emergency motion, citing lack of evidence and potential risk to stadium operations. But he didn't stop. Volunteers came and went. Some returned on weekends with fresh energy. Others faded out after a few days. Greg remained. Fans attending new games would see him pacing behind the third baseline, handing out laminated flyers, asking the same 3 questions. Were you here that night? Do you remember seeing this boy? Did anything seem off? Some responded kindly. Others ignored him. A few grew irritated. But Greg didn't care. He wasn't waiting for sympathy. He was waiting for someone to remember something they hadn't realized was important the first time around. Police began documenting Greg's behavior. Not out of suspicion. There was still no indication he had anything to do with Daniel's disappearance, but out of concern. His routines had become rigid. He stopped answering calls from extended family. He ate rarely and barely slept. He refused all forms of counseling. When investigators asked again if Daniel might have had a reason to leave voluntarily, Greg shut down the conversation. He insisted his son wasn't like that. Daniel didn't sneak off. He didn't play games. And if he'd left on his own, someone would have seen him. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a volunteer named Donna Simmons was helping organize old supplies near a stadium tunnel rarely used during the off-season. It connected the vendor's locker area to a gated trash chute behind the outfield wall. While sorting through boxes, she noticed something half-jammed behind a drainage grate. She reached in and pulled out what looked like a torn ticket stub, partially water-damaged, edges frayed. The ink was still legible. It was Daniel's. Same section, same row, same seat. But what stunned investigators wasn't that it had been found. It was the timestamp. It was scanned at 9:38 p.m. That was nearly an hour after Greg reported Daniel missing. At first, police thought it might have been a duplicate. They checked with the stadium's ticketing system. Each stub had a unique barcode tied to its original. Purchaser Greg's purchase history confirmed only one ticket had been issued in Daniel's name, which meant it had been scanned again after the boy was supposedly gone. The scanner log didn't record direction, only that the barcode passed through the lower west gate at that time. If it was accurate, Daniel had either returned to the stadium or someone had his ticket. The discovery sent a shock through the case. Investigators returned to the footage, but the gate's nearby camera had been facing the parking lot and hadn't captured the turnstile itself. No staff on shift remembered seeing anything unusual. The area was poorly lit, and by 9:30 p.m. the crowd had already thinned. Most fans were heading home. If Daniel had passed through then, no one had noticed. Greg interpreted it differently. To him, the stub wasn't just a clue, it was proof. Proof that Daniel had still been alive at 9:38 p.m., that something happened after he vanished, that he hadn't wandered off into the woods or fallen victim to some accident no one could explain. Someone had swiped that stub, someone who knew where scanners were, someone who used it for a reason. Police re-interviewed vendors, gate attendants, even temporary hires from that night. But by then, too much time had passed. People forgot faces, schedules were murky. Half the staff had rotated out since the start of the season. The stadium didn't keep full personnel records beyond 3 months for temp workers. The case slipped again into ambiguity. Greg began taping copies of the scanned stub to light poles, coffee shop doors, even bathroom walls around Ridgeport. His message was always the same. Someone passed through this gate with my son's ticket. Please remember, as the summer wore on, so did Greg's body. He lost weight, his eyes sunk. His voice grew quieter, but the urgency never faded. To many, he became part of the background, the man at the fence, always watching. But to himself, he was still a father waiting in the exact place his son had last been seen. And now, with the stub found deep in a tunnel that led nowhere, he was more convinced than ever that Daniel never left the stadium. The question was whether he had been led somewhere no one had ever looked, or whether someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make it seem that way. Nearly a month after Daniel Rudd disappeared, investigators took another hard look at the layout of Section 34. Something had been bothering them since the beginning, something small that hadn't stood out until a retired officer reviewing the footage noticed it during a third pass. Every vendor who worked that night had been logged, roster sheets, badge scans, inventory logs. But one detail stood out. Along the aisle that bordered Daniel's row, between seat 18 and the tunnel walkway, there had been a popcorn cart. None of the vendor rosters listed a popcorn seller assigned to that location. No receipts were processed from it. No name. No work badge. Just the memory of buttered popcorn in the air and the reports of a man in a faded red shirt who never came back the next day. Fans seated in neighboring sections were re-interviewed. A few remembered buying popcorn near the end of the 7th inning. One woman recalled the vendor standing oddly still, not shouting, not calling for sales like the others, just watching the crowd. Another said she thought the vendor had no name tag, but she hadn't paid attention. It was crowded, and she was rushing back to her seat before the next pitch. No one could remember his face clearly. He was described as white, maybe mid-30s, short-cropped hair, possibly a scar on his cheek. But no one got a clear look. He didn't speak much, he wasn't loud, and by the time the game ended, he was gone. Police requested internal vendor contracts from stadium management. That's when they discovered that for one night only, A last-minute subcontract had been authorized to fill a shortfall in snack staffing. The company listed was Core Field Event Services, a third-party vendor out of Harrisburg. Investigators contacted the listed phone number. It had been disconnected. The address led to an empty suite in a strip mall. No one by that company name had registered with the Pennsylvania Department of Labor. There were no tax records, no permits, no paper trail. The company didn't exist. The popcorn cart had been picked up by maintenance early the next morning, left unattended behind the visitors' locker room. By the time police were alerted, the cart had already been cleaned and returned to storage. No usable prints, no trace DNA, nothing unusual beyond a broken wheel and one torn glove caught between the warming tray and the bin liner. The glove was latex. Forensics ran analysis. No blood, no fingerprints, just trace residue of oil and salt. Standard stadium food handling. A composite sketch was created based on witness descriptions, though none were detailed enough for a clear image. It showed a man with a neutral expression, angular features, and short-cropped hair. The scar was included, although it was based on a single witness and couldn't be confirmed. The sketch was distributed to surrounding jurisdictions. No matches, no vendor agencies recognized the man. When the sketch was released to the public, tips came flooding in. One woman thought it looked like her ex-husband. Another said it resembled a customer she'd once kicked out of her diner. Dozens of names were submitted. None panned out. The presence of the unauthorized vendor redefined the theory. If Daniel had been lured, the opportunity now made more sense. The vendor's position put him within feet of the boy's seat. He would have had a direct line of sight, possibly even casual interaction. And if the cart wasn't officially logged, there would have been no accountability. He could have slipped in, worked for an hour, then vanished. When detectives ran the sketch, through a broader state database of prior arrests and sealed juvenile offenses, no direct matches appeared. The theory that the man had used a stolen uniform or badge from another vendor gained traction, but there was no proof. More disturbing was what this suggested about access. The stadium was supposed to be locked down to credentialed staff. Vendors were required to check in with ID and badges tied to barcode scanners. Yet someone had bypassed all of that, or had help. Investigators looked into staff logs, specifically those working security check-ins that evening. All scanned entries appeared accounted for. No anomalies. But one entry, vendor badge 514, had been manually entered into the logbook without a digital scan. Just a timestamp. 6:47 p.m. No initials, no name, just the number. When stadium officials were confronted with the badge number, they claimed it belonged to a vendor who had quit weeks earlier. The badge should have been deactivated. Police requested access to badge assignment records, but many were incomplete. The stadium's security system had undergone a software upgrade just days before the game. Several entries from that night showed signs of manual override. No one could explain why. Greg Rudd was informed of the new theory, and his reaction was immediate. He returned to Section 34, stared at the aisle where the cart had been, and simply said he knew it. He had felt it for weeks, that someone had been too close, too fast, too quiet. He remembered Daniel glancing toward the aisle, distracted, just minutes before he stood up to leave. And now there was a face, blurry, incomplete, but real. Someone had been there, someone who shouldn't have. The sketch remained pinned on the bulletin board in the police station for months. No confirmed identity ever came. The man in the red shirt had vanished just as easily as Daniel had. But unlike Daniel, he had left just enough behind to make it clear. Whoever he was, he didn't belong there. And someone let him in. It was the kind of envelope police stations receive all the time. Plain, unmarked, no return address beyond a ZIP code scribbled in blue ink. It arrived in late July 2013, over a year since Daniel Rudd had vanished from Ridgeport Stadium. The case had long since cooled, its leads gone stale, the volunteers moved on. But when the front desk clerk opened it, what fell out was enough to stop the shift sergeant mid-coffee. A Ridgeport Hounds game day program. Faded, wrinkled, with a single sticky note attached. From the night the boy went missing. I just found this in storage. Please test it. Taped to the inside cover was a handwritten letter, unsigned but later traced back to a woman named Sarah Dwyer. She had been at the June 23, 2012 game, seated 4 rows behind where Greg and Daniel Rudd had sat. She said she'd attended with her sister and her nephew. They had left during the 8th inning and hadn't thought about the boy's disappearance until weeks later when the story began to take over local news. She wrote that she wasn't sure why she kept the program, but found it again while cleaning her garage the previous week. There was something strange about it, something she hadn't noticed before. In the lower corner of the 5th page, where the team's pitching roster was printed, a faint brown stain bled across the edge of the paper, and beside it, written in shaky black ink, were 5 chilling words. Don't go past row H. The writing was small, uneven, not part of the printed page. The note hadn't been there when she first got the program. She was sure of it. And yet, there it was. Row H. The exact row Daniel Rudd had vanished from. Police immediately sent the program to the forensic lab. The stain tested positive for blood, but the sample was too degraded and too small to extract viable DNA. It could have come from anyone, at any time, and the age of the stain couldn't be conclusively dated. Still, it wasn't nothing. Handwriting analysis was performed next. The note didn't match Daniel's. Samples of his handwriting from schoolwork and notes at home showed clean, consistent cursive. This was printed, uneven, possibly rushed. The forensics team couldn't determine gender or age of the writer, but it appeared to have been written by someone using their non-dominant hand. Intentional obfuscation, a choice, not a tremor. Detectives met with Sarah Dwyer in person. She was cooperative, nervous, and genuinely unsettled. She said she hadn't noticed anything strange that night. No odd behavior, no suspicious people in her row. But when asked directly whether anyone had passed behind her, maybe brushed her seat, maybe dropped the program, she hesitated. She remembered a man bumping her shoulder around the bottom of the 7th. She'd been standing up, stretching, and someone had brushed past, heading toward the back tunnel. She couldn't remember his face, only that he wore a hat pulled low and didn't make eye contact. She had chalked it up to an impatient fan heading to the restroom or a vendor moving through. But now, thinking back, she remembered that he hadn't returned. Everyone else who left that inning came back to their seats. That man didn't. She hadn't reported it because it hadn't seemed important. At the time, no one even knew Daniel was missing. Police pulled the original seating chart. Sarah's ticket placed her in section 34, row L, seat 22, directly behind Daniel's row, 4 seats over. If the man had been moving down that aisle, he would have passed both of them. The theory emerged quickly. The program had been dropped deliberately, or maybe forgotten in a rush. Maybe the note had been meant for someone else, or maybe it had been planted. The note became the focus of every internal meeting for weeks. Don't go past row H. Was it a warning, a message, a clue to something deeper? The phrase was maddening in its ambiguity. If someone had written it that night, they had done so with enough confidence to assume it would be found. But why not turn it in directly? Why wait a year? Investigators combed through every photo taken by fans in that section during the game. Cell phone videos, group selfies, panoramic crowd shots. They were looking for anything. Someone standing alone, someone looking at the wrong part of the field, someone holding a pen. Nothing stood out. The man Sarah mentioned was never identified. The seat where the program had likely been left was cleaned that night with the rest of the section. No notes were filed. No one reported anything unusual. Eventually, the program was sealed in evidence, labeled Exhibit 6F. The bloodstain couldn't speak. The handwriting told no story. And the woman who had unknowingly kept it for 13 months could offer nothing more than a vague memory of a bump and a face she couldn't place. Still, the message lingered. It wasn't just ominous. It was personal. It referenced the exact row where a child had disappeared in plain sight. It implied a knowledge of something others weren't supposed to see. It became the kind of detail that detectives returned to during sleepless nights, the kind they hoped would line up with something, someday. But it didn't. The program had come out of nowhere, carrying just enough weight to feel real and just enough doubt to feel like a dead end. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even a solid lead. But it was a voice, one that hadn't spoken when it mattered most. And behind that voice was someone who had been close enough to touch Daniel, close enough to write that message, and close enough to walk away without anyone ever knowing they were there. By 2017, Ridgeport Stadium was no longer just a home for minor league baseball. It had become a symbol of heartbreak, of failure, and for Greg Rudd, of unfinished business. The team had announced a multi-million-dollar renovation plan, new seats, expanded concessions, updated lighting, and structural improvements beneath the bleachers. Local officials celebrated it as progress. But for Greg, it felt like an erasure. The stadium wasn't just where his son vanished, it was where the investigation had run into walls, literal and procedural, and now the walls were going to be torn down before the truth ever got through them. He'd never stopped going back. Not really. The visits were less frequent now, spaced out over months instead of days, but his truck still showed up in the same lot. He still paced the perimeter when no one was looking. He still stood in Section 34, eyes locked on Seat 18. And when he heard about the demolition plan, he moved fast. He contacted local reporters. He called every city official tied to the project. He launched a petition titled "Don't Bury the Evidence," arguing that the stadium's understructure had never been properly searched, that parts of the investigation had been blocked by infrastructure excuses, and that if the renovation moved forward, any hidden trace of Daniel's fate might be lost forever. The petition gained traction online. What started as a quiet plea from a grieving father turned into a public campaign. People remembered the case. Old interviews resurfaced. News outlets revisited the timeline. Within weeks, the petition had over 40,000 signatures. Some signed out of empathy. Others believed the investigation had always felt too convenient in its failure. And some, especially former stadium workers, signed out of guilt. That's how the email came in. It was anonymous, routed through an encrypted server, written in plain language. The sender claimed to have worked maintenance at Ridgeport Stadium during the 2012 season and stayed on through the following year. He said that in late 2013, a specific request came down, quiet, undocumented, to seal off a crawl space beneath Section 35, one row over from where Daniel had last been seen. The reason, he said, was damage from a water leak. But no work orders were filed, no city permits pulled. He said the team was instructed to pour quickset concrete over the floor and reinforce it with plywood. He remembered it vividly because it was the only time in his career he was told not to file a report. The email arrived at the Ridgeport Police Department's cold case inbox. It was flagged by an intern and escalated within hours. Investigators reached out to current and former stadium staff, but most either claimed no knowledge or had already moved on. The name in the email couldn't be verified, but the specific detail about Section 35 caught attention. That area had long been off-limits during the initial search due to reported flooding after a spring storm. At the time, police were told it had been inaccessible, but no official closure notice had ever been located in the investigation files. And now, someone was saying that not only had it been accessed, it had been sealed. Detectives approached stadium management quietly. They requested access to engineering plans from 2012 through 2014. The team complied, but the files were incomplete. Permits were missing for several structural repairs. City building records didn't show any activity in Section 35. A request was made to bring in forensic engineers before any demolition began. The stadium resisted at first, citing cost and disruption to the renovation timeline. But with media pressure mounting, they eventually agreed, under the condition that the search remain private unless something definitive was found. Greg Rudd wasn't told at first. Police wanted time to validate the lead before reopening old wounds. But word got out. A journalist, who had covered the original case, got wind of the investigation through a contact in city planning. She called Greg personally. He showed up the next morning, standing outside the locked gates, watching the crew unload radar equipment. He didn't say anything, just waited. The forensic engineers scanned the crawl space beneath Section 35. The area in question measured less than 30 feet wide, but showed clear signs of post-construction fill. The ground was uneven, the material layered in ways inconsistent with original construction. Beneath the concrete was wood paneling, and beneath that, what looked like soil that hadn't been touched in years. The scan alone wasn't enough for a full excavation. The area was still structurally tied to the stadium's support system, but it was enough for police to file for an emergency excavation order. And it was enough to quietly move Daniel Rudd's case out of cold storage and back onto the active docket. The stadium renovations were delayed indefinitely. The team issued a press release citing logistical adjustments. But inside the walls of Ridgeport PD, something had shifted. For the first time in years, there was a reason to believe that a piece of Daniel might still be there, not in theory, not in rumor, but in physical space. A hidden crawl space, sealed without permit, known only to someone who had reason to keep it closed. Greg Rudd stood beside the newly cordoned area for over 2 hours. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. When asked by a reporter what he hoped they'd find, he said he didn't care if it was a sock, a bone, a fingerprint, or nothing at all. He just wanted proof that someone had been trying to hide something. Because for 5 years, all he had was absence. And now, finally, there was a door that shouldn't have existed, quietly buried beneath Section 35. In March of 2025, the Ridgeport Hounds prepared for another season. A new coat of paint on the dugouts, LED lighting on the scoreboard, and fresh seating audits throughout the upper and lower levels. A few parts of the stadium had been updated following the paused renovations in 2017, but much of the old infrastructure remained. Among the seasonal hires was an intern named Colin, 21, working his first off-season operations job. He was assigned to walk each section and note anything broken, loose, or rusted. It was routine work. Most seats clicked back into place with a little force, but when he reached Section 34, Row H, he paused. One of the seats, Seat 18, wouldn't budge. It was stuck in the open position, slightly tilted forward, as if held in place by something inside the hinge. Colin made a note, tried pushing harder, then radioed maintenance. They arrived 20 minutes later. At first, they assumed it was just a bolt issue, years of weather warping the frame, but when they removed the side panel, they saw something blocking the fold mechanism. A small, flat object jammed deep where the seat met the rusted bracket. The crew chief reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it out. It was a plastic laminate badge, creased, water-warped, and sun-faded. The logo on the front was partially scraped off, but just enough remained to identify it. It belonged to a food vendor called Corefield Event Services. The name hadn't been heard in over a decade. The company had shut down in 2012, just weeks after Daniel Rudd disappeared. When the badge was turned over to stadium security, they forwarded it immediately to Ridgeport PD. Investigators pulled the old case file that same afternoon. The discovery wasn't just a coincidence, it was a flashpoint. That vendor had been the subject of multiple failed leads, the one no one could trace, the one who had somehow worked a shift without a name, without a contract, without leaving a footprint. And now, 13 years later, something with that logo had been pulled from Daniel Rudd's last known location. The badge was sent for analysis, laminated plastic, standard issue, no barcode, no ID photo, just a faded print logo, a bent corner, and a slight crack down the middle. But inside the laminate, caught in the inner fold between layers of melted adhesive, was something forensic teams hadn't expected. A single hair, curled, degraded, but intact. It took weeks to extract and clean. Ridgeport PD submitted it to the state lab along with a reference sample from Greg Rudd, who had never withdrawn his consent for DNA comparison. The result came back with 99.97% certainty. The hair belonged to Daniel Rudd. Investigators sat with the findings for 2 days before making the call to Greg. He didn't speak for the first full minute. Then he asked only one question: where exactly was the badge found? When they told him, he didn't respond. He just thanked them and hung up. The media got hold of the story by week's end. A local paper ran the headline, "Stadium Seat May Hold, Key to 13-Year Mystery." The badge became evidence item 7. Photos were released to the press. The stadium faced renewed scrutiny. And yet the central question remained unanswered. How did the badge end up inside that hinge? It wasn't a place someone would casually drop something. The maintenance panel covered the bracket. You couldn't see inside it. To wedge something in that spot, you'd have to know the panel could come off. You'd have to have a reason to hide it. And more than that, you'd have to be close. Theories swirled. One possibility was that the badge had fallen into the seat hinge that night, lodged itself, and gone unnoticed for over a decade. But stadium staff rejected that. The seats had been cleaned, maintained, repainted. That row had been used before. Folded, unfolded, scrubbed. The seat had worked until recently. If the badge had been there the whole time, why didn't it jam the mechanism earlier? Why now? A second theory carried more weight. The badge had been placed there deliberately, perhaps by someone revisiting the scene, a former employee, a guilty conscience, a message. Investigators reviewed stadium logs from the past 2 years. No suspicious access, no break-ins. The stadium didn't keep footage beyond 90 days. Nothing suggested a recent intrusion, which left a chilling third option. Whoever had placed the badge there had done so years ago, quietly, methodically, with enough knowledge to know it wouldn't be found unless something eventually went wrong. That seat hadn't just been where Daniel was last seen. It had become the silent witness to everything that followed. And now, it had spoken. The DNA match was the first physical evidence tying Daniel to anything since the ticket stub 13 months after his disappearance. It didn't reveal who took him. It didn't explain what happened. But it proved one thing, that Daniel had come into contact with someone holding that badge, and that person had been close, within feet, possibly seated in the same row, possibly the one who told him to stand up, possibly the one who never came back. The badge was sent to Quantico for further material analysis. Greg didn't wait for the report. He drove back to Ridgeport Stadium for the first time in nearly 2 years. He stood in front of seat 18, stared at the hinge that had finally refused to close, and said nothing. Some called it a breakthrough. Others called it a cruel half-answer. But whatever it was, it proved the case had never been cold. Just quiet, waiting. For 13 years, that seat had held a secret no one knew to look for. And now that it was broken, so was the silence. Once the DNA match on the badge was confirmed, the case shifted almost overnight. Ridgeport PD, long accused of mishandling the earliest days of the investigation, suddenly had something tangible, an object, a connection, a place to go. They reopened every vendor file from the 2012 game, combing through scanned badges, time logs, payroll stubs, and last-minute contractor paperwork. That's when they found the name, Louis Granger. Age 24 at the time. No state vendor license, no tax ID, just a hastily printed name on a one-night volunteer roster submitted by Corefield Event Services. The form had been manually filled in. No digital submission. The signature at the bottom wasn't legible. Investigators dug deeper. Granger didn't appear in any public employment databases, but when the name was run against sealed juvenile records, records that require court approval to access, something hit. A single entry flagged by a narrow exception clause. Granger had a sealed record from 2003 involving attempted luring of a minor. He had been 12. The case had been expunged under youth protection laws, and no conviction followed. But the behavioral flags were noted in the system. At the time of Daniel's disappearance, Granger was 21. Too old to be considered a minor, too disconnected from any official vendor registry, and somehow still working that night under false credentials. They traced the address listed on the vendor form to a house on the outskirts of Ridgeport, down a dirt road behind a stretch of abandoned fencing. The property had changed ownership twice since 2013, but records showed it sat empty for 3 years prior. Officers were dispatched to secure the site. The house was boarded, dust-covered, but unlocked. Inside, they found signs that someone had lived there, but not recently. The power had been cut in 2014. Most of the furniture was gone, but in one of the back rooms where the carpet had been torn up and the walls stripped of paint, they found 3 items that stopped the investigation cold. First, a pile of old stadium vendor shirts, some faded red, some bleached gray, folded neatly in a corner. Second, a stack of snack wrappers, torn popcorn bags, and unopened cups still bearing the Ridgeport Hounds logo from a discontinued design used only during the 2012 season. And third, taped to the inside of a closet door, 5 clippings from local newspapers, all about Daniel. One headline read, "Boy vanishes from stadium without a trace." Another showed Greg Rudd holding up a flyer outside Section 34. Each article had notes scribbled in the margins, times, row numbers, the phrase "no one saw" underlined twice in blue ink. They dusted the space for fingerprints, nothing usable, no blood, no electronics, no signs of surveillance. But a neighbor remembered a man living there around the time of the disappearance, kept to himself, always wore baseball hats, drove an old sedan that vanished one night in the spring of 2013 and never came back. She didn't know his name, just remembered he left the lights on all night and once sat on the porch eating popcorn from a clear bag long after midnight. Police circulated Granger's photo to former stadium employees. A handful thought he looked familiar. One janitor swore he remembered him sweeping the South Concourse on the night Daniel vanished, but the timeline was vague. The DNA evidence from the badge shifted the status of the case. Daniel was no longer classified as a missing person. He was now presumed dead. The cause and manner remained undetermined, but legally, the change altered everything. New warrants were granted. The case moved from cold to active, with Granger now listed as a prime suspect. But finding him proved impossible. Every lead went nowhere. No bank records, no employment, no medical history after 2012. He hadn't renewed his driver's license, hadn't filed taxes, hadn't left a digital footprint in over a decade. They checked homeless shelters, federal registries, mental health databases. He wasn't in prison. He wasn't in the system. To law enforcement, it was like chasing a ghost who'd stepped out of one moment in time and disappeared back into the shadows of it. Greg Rudd was brought into the station to review the findings. They showed him the photos from the abandoned house, the vendor shirts, the newspaper clippings, the blue underlined phrase. He stared at the images in silence. Then he asked what they were going to do next. When detectives said they'd issue a nationwide alert, Greg responded with only 4 words. He's not that. The media ran the story for weeks. Vendor suspect identified in stadium disappearance. The sketch from 2012 was updated using newer software. Age progression models were created. The public was warned that Granger may have altered his appearance or assumed a new identity. But no credible sightings emerged. Nothing came in. Not a single confirmed trace of a man whose name was once buried on a forged sheet of paper and whose fingerprints weren't in any system that mattered. And still, that badge, pulled from the rusted hinge of seat 18, remained the one undeniable link. Proof that Granger had been close, that Daniel had touched something Granger touched, that the man in the red shirt, who had never existed on paper, had once walked that concourse, watched those seats, stood within feet of a boy who didn't make it to the 8th inning, and then disappeared, just like Daniel did. In the summer of 2025, 13 years after Daniel Rudd vanished without a sound during a packed baseball game, Ridgeport PD returned to the place where it all started. Armed with new warrants and forensic excavation teams, they began breaking into the sealed crawl space beneath Section 34. It had long been rumored, long denied, long sealed, its existence whispered about by former workers in half-remembered blueprints, but never officially entered. Until now. The hatch was located beneath a rusted maintenance panel behind the visiting bullpen, welded shut with industrial fasteners that hadn't seen light since the 2013 flood repairs. When it was opened, the air inside was heavy and dry, as if it hadn't moved in years. The tunnel stretched no more than 15 feet, a low, narrow crawl space, barely tall enough to kneel in. Dust coated every surface, thick and undisturbed. At first, it looked empty, but as the forensic team scanned deeper, they found a recess beneath a warped plywood slab. Someone had created a small pit, intentional, deliberate, and hidden under layers of discarded debris. What they found inside would fracture the silence that had hovered over Ridgeport for more than a decade. Scattered within the depression were bones, some small, some long, some charred. It took hours to retrieve them all, piece by piece. Among them were fragments clearly identified as animal remains, rodent, raccoon, possibly stray dogs. But others were different. A partial femur, 3 finger bones, a cracked portion of a human jaw. Not enough for a full skeleton, but too much to dismiss. DNA testing began immediately, and within days, confirmation came. One of the bones carried a mitochondrial match to Greg Rudd. It belonged to Daniel. Buried in the dust beside the bones was a shoe, faded, frayed at the heel, laces torn. Greg had identified it without hesitation. He remembered buying them 6 weeks before the game. Daniel had picked them out himself, black and white with a red logo stitched near the heel. He hadn't worn anything else since. It was the last detail that felt like his son. Everything else, the space, the silence, the scattered remains, felt like someone else's idea of a grave. Tucked between the boards was a small towel, discolored and stiff. It looked like a piece of discarded vendor stock, the kind used for cleaning concession counters. But in the fibers was blood. 2 separate profiles. One belonged to Daniel, the other belonged to Lewis Granger. The narrative that investigators had feared for over a decade began to take shape. They believed Daniel had been lured, either by someone pretending to be a vendor or someone offering help. He may have followed willingly, trusting the badge, the cart, the uniform. Once inside the service corridor, there was no camera, no visibility, no way out. Police believe he was taken into the tunnel during the game itself, possibly between innings, while noise masked movement. And then, something happened. Fast, violent, and final. The scorch marks on the bones suggested heat damage, but no one could say when or how. Whether it was an attempt to destroy evidence or something else entirely, the truth remained fragmented. The tunnel was never part of the official stadium renovation plans. No documentation showed it existed. No maintenance logs, no engineering drawings. It had been built decades earlier, possibly during original construction, and later forgotten or hidden. The fact that no one had been allowed to search it during the original investigation now looked like more than just red tape. It looked like omission. Whether intentional or not, it allowed the truth to remain buried just feet below the surface, while games continued above. News of the discovery spread quickly. National outlets picked up the story. The narrative of a boy vanishing in plain sight, only to be found 13 years later, beneath the very place he disappeared, captured public imagination. Debates reignited about stadium accountability, investigatory delays, and the systemic failures that let the crawl space remain untouched for so long. But for Greg Rudd, none of that mattered. Not anymore. He set up camp again in the same place he had parked 13 years earlier, Lot B, facing the east entrance, a folding chair, a cooler, a notebook. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't answer messages. He just waited. When asked by a detective if he wanted to be part of the final forensic debrief, he said no. He had already known, from the first night, from the way the seat felt cold when he sat back down, from the way no one had seen Daniel leave. He didn't need science to tell him where his son had gone. He only needed someone to finally open the door. The bones were turned over to a forensic pathologist. The remains were too partial for a formal cause of death. The DNA on the towel made the legal shift official. Daniel Rudd's case was reclassified as a homicide. But with Granger long gone and no further forensic material in the tunnel, the charges remained hypothetical. There would be no trial, no arrest, no confession. All that remained was a hole in the ground, filled in again, sealed off under new concrete, and above it, Section 34, where fans still cheered, where lights still blazed, and where Seat 18 now sat forever locked open, never folding again. Just like it had the day someone forced it closed around a secret that took 13 years to rise back to the surface. After months of excavation, analysis, and press cycles that pushed the case into national consciousness once more, Ridgeport Stadium made a decision. It wasn't part of any public relations campaign. It didn't come with a press conference or ribbon cutting. One morning before opening day, stadium workers removed Seat 18 from Row H, Section 34. The bolts came out easily. The hinge that had jammed in 2025 was still marked with red chalk from the forensics team. The seat itself was faded beyond restoration. It was replaced with a smooth steel plate, and in its place, a single plaque was mounted to the backrest in quiet silver. It read, "In memory of Daniel Rudd." July 4th, 1997, June 23rd, 2012. This seat shall remain unfilled. The section was roped off for the first home game of the season. A moment of silence was held in the 8th inning. After that, life inside the stadium returned to something close to normal. New fans arrived who didn't know the full story. Children wore jerseys. Concession lines returned. But no one ever sat in Row H. Not anymore. Daniel's body was never recovered in full. The fragments found beneath Section 34, those confirmed by DNA, were turned over to the Rudd family for burial. There was no casket, just a sealed box. And even that couldn't explain how the rest of him had vanished without a trace. The scorched remains provided no clear cause of death. The towel with dual DNA could place Granger at the scene, but couldn't confirm motive, time, or method. It was evidence, but not enough for closure. Louis Granger remained a wanted man. The FBI added him to their most wanted database under the category of fugitive suspected in child homicide. Posters were circulated again. Facial age progression was used to generate updated renderings. But nothing came back. No verified sightings, no digital footprint, no bank activity, not a single confirmed transaction, phone call, or ID renewal since 2013. He had disappeared more thoroughly than anyone expected. Some believed he had changed identities and moved across state lines. Others believed he had died long ago, possibly by suicide, possibly buried somewhere as obscure as the crawl space he used. Officially, Granger was declared wanted, but privately, most investigators accepted the same conclusion. He was gone. Security at Ridgeport Stadium changed in response to the case. Vendor policies were rewritten. Background checks became mandatory. A new internal credentialing system was installed, and digital badges replaced the plastic ones. Hidden cameras were added to blind spots in the concourse. Emergency response drills were practiced monthly. But the changes felt like an apology made too late, like locks added to doors after the house had already been emptied. There were still questions no one could answer. Why did Granger target Daniel? Was it premeditated or opportunistic? Did he know the stadium layout before that night, or did he stumble into the tunnel by chance? And the most unsettling question of all, did someone else help him? The manual logbook entry for vendor badge 514 had never been explained. The absence of camera footage, the ease with which Granger moved through secured zones, the fact that the crawl space had remained sealed for years without record, it suggested knowledge, access, maybe even cooperation. But no one else was ever identified, and no formal charges were filed against stadium staff. Just silence. For Greg Rudd, the ending brought neither peace nor resolution. He visited the plaque once, not during a game, not during the ceremony. Just early one morning, long before the gates opened. He stood alone at the edge of Section 34, looking down at the seat that now couldn't be touched. He stayed for less than 5 minutes. Then, he turned around and left. He didn't go back. He declined all interview requests. He moved out of Ridgeport later that year. A neighbor said he packed everything into a small trailer and drove east, but no one knew exactly where. His house was sold in probate, his number disconnected. Some say he started over in Maine, others say he lives in a cabin near the Canadian border, but the truth is, most people stopped asking. Because after 13 years, after press releases and forensic breakthroughs and questions that never quite led to answers, the story became what so many of them do, a closed loop with a missing center. The stadium still draws crowds. Summer nights still buzz with cheap beer and fly balls. Seat 18 is still there, still visible, but never occupied. Occasionally, a tourist stops to take a picture. Sometimes, a child asks why the seat is empty. And the answer varies. Some say it's bad luck. Others say it's out of respect. But the truth lies in a silence that no speaker system or scoreboard ever quite manages to drown out. It's the silence of a boy who vanished in plain sight. The silence of a vendor no one remembered hiring. The silence of a stadium that, for 13 years, stood above something buried and said nothing. And now, it's the silence of a seat that sits alone, not because of what it holds, but because of what it never let go.